Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our podcast on the importance of teaching comprehension in the early years. And welcome to our literacy expert, Diane Snowball. Welcome, Di.
Hi, Phil. Nice to be here again with you, doing your wonderful work.
And what have you been up to lately?
Well, I've been doing a lot of reading about the teaching of comprehension. No matter all of the years of you learning, it never stops, does it? And, in the show notes, I'll include lots of really good references to articles that are freely available online and some webcasts on such things as YouTube, etc., so that people can continue to read beyond what we talk about today. And I want to make that point because I have found it really useful for myself to go back over the whole topic and read about what people are writing about and talking about now to make sure that there's so much about comprehension to know about, and that the more you understand about it, the better your teaching can be. So I really want people to go beyond the podcast, and so I've been looking for a lot of material that can help them with that.
That's great. And, well, let's start with why is it necessary to focus on comprehension, do you think?
Well,
especially in the early years.
Yeah, especially, and continuing, of course.
Yep.
Of course, word recognition, that includes the phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition are important. And particularly at the moment, there's an incredible amount of all sorts of resources available on that topic. How you should teach phonics is sort of like, you'd think that was the only thing that mattered. There's so much about it. And although there's a lot written about already on the topic of comprehension, and there are a couple of really good podcasts that I'll refer to in the teaching notes as well. But I just think we really need to say, let's just focus on this aspect of it in our teaching to make sure we're doing it well and to make sure that it's being done equally as well as the word recognition work we're doing. And I think that's particularly important in the early years because there are some people who will say, even to this day, first of all, you learn to read and then you read to learn. And that is so out of date and so untrue that I think we need to focus on how much the teaching of comprehension can and should happen right from the start, so that it's not that we're waiting until they've got word recognition under their belt before we even think about it. And this is easy to do because listening comprehension can happen even before children can decode words, so that what they understand about reading by listening to stories and how to understand them, they can then apply when they are able to decode and say words. Then they can be applying what they know about comprehension because of the listening work they've been doing. So from the first day at school, what we choose to read aloud to our children and how we use that resource can help children's comprehension develop. Of course, families where kids are being read to a lot at home, the children are doing an incredible amount of learning about comprehension. I find that if you let them, they will interrupt your reading and ask questions because they're really trying to understand more about what it's about. So they're sort of innately aware that it's not enough just to say words, but you've really got to understand what they're about. And parents will also make comments like, I remember that was like when we went to grandma's. So it's like they innately understand that even relating to children's own experiences, the text that they're reading is going to be understood more when they've got that sort of experience to draw upon. So I think that without even knowing what they're doing, before school starts, there's a lot of great comprehension, learning and teaching going on through read aloud and what children are thinking about while they're being read to. So let's be really cognizant of how we can improve that or feel good about what we're doing if we're already doing it in school. It's a very important topic because it's not good enough to just say words, of course. We all know that if the children don't understand what those words and sentences and texts are about, then they're not really reading.
So listening comprehension is really important, and that can be done through read aloud. Where do you start when you're starting with foundation year? What would you be starting with in comprehension teaching?
Well, there's a number of things that make a big difference straight away, and things that we shouldn't just take for granted as teachers, that the kids will actually know what something's about. So first of all, I guess I want to think about being very selective about what I read to the children, because I know that will dramatically influence their comprehension. So my first planning is sort of thinking, in the next few weeks when school starts, what will I read to the children that will give me the opportunities to do all of the teaching and learning that I want to happen with comprehension? And so that means, because I know that comprehension development is going to be very much influenced by what background knowledge that a reader has about what's being read, about the content, that the familiarity with the language structures, that's the structures of the text and the way the text works, is very, very helpful to be able to understand. But even being able to unpack what a sentence might mean, so that, for example, even if I say that Goldilocks ate the bear's porridge, then do I even make sure that the children know that the main person is Goldilocks and she is actually doing something? What is she doing? So that information itself, that Goldilocks is eating. And I would also need to be very wary of, do the children know what the word porridge means? Because the vocabulary of what's in the text is going to influence how much they understand. So I'm very conscious of thinking, what will the children need to know in order to understand what this text is about?
Oh, yes.
And even knowing that it's a story, and in this case, a made-up story, not necessarily a realistic story, and I would even use that it's not necessarily something that a girl would do. So this story is like being made up, not necessarily a factual type story that you might have in your own experiences, because it wouldn't be normal for a girl to go into someone else's house and start eating their food. So, some kids, particularly if they were not used to fairy tales, might wonder what in the world this is all about. And because we understand it so easily, we can take for granted that they know that this is about someone doing something and that there's vocabulary needed in the background to understand what it's about and what would that background knowledge be. So I need to be aware as a teacher of what the things are that will influence the comprehension and be thinking about those in the first place when I'm just reading to kids, and knowing also that what they develop as listeners, they'll be able to apply to reading when they really are independently able to use word recognition and say the words on the page. And in fact, some researchers are worried that if we don't continue listening comprehension through the grades using more and more complex material that we're reading aloud to the kids, that their listening comprehension may not continue to develop through this more complex material, and therefore they won't be able to apply that in their own reading to more complex material. So isn't that an interesting
That is very
thought
interesting.
about
Yeah.
why we should continue to read aloud to kids? You know, we've always known we should, and, you know, we want to keep introducing them to new literature and new authors and new topics and whatever, and it's a very enjoyable experience. But how much it might affect the kids' reading comprehension if the listening comprehension hasn't had a chance to continue to develop. So there's a lot of things that I'm thinking of right at the start that are going to influence the kids' comprehension forever, really. So some of those other things would be that I know those language structures that are in whatever I choose to read aloud to the kids, that they have to hear those language structures many times over and in many texts to become very familiar with that's the way written language works. Because if they are, then that's definitely going to help their comprehension. You know, they're not trying to work out. And what I mean by that is a sentence could be, the dog ate the bone, or the sentence could be, the bone was eaten by the dog. And they both mean the same thing. But if children have never heard that second type of language structure, the passive type, then they may not be able to say who's doing what to whom. If they didn't know that's the same as the dog ate the bone, then they may not understand those sentences when they read them because they're not used to hearing language being used in that sort of structure, particularly if English is not their first language. You know, each language has its own structures. And so what I'm saying would apply to whether it was going to be French or Spanish or English or whatever. I know that those two languages have different language structures to ours. So Spanish kids would need to hear a lot of Spanish sentences being read.
It's like German has, instead of 24, they say 4 and 20.
Right,
it's different,
exactly.
Different orders.
Or in French, they would say, the grass green rather than the green grass.
Yep.
The adjective comes after the noun. So in order for kids to hear those language structures and become familiar with them, then we need to read aloud a lot and a lot of different kinds of texts. And that's even part of comprehension is affected by what we would call the literacy knowledge, which includes concepts of print. And for beginning readers, that's even knowing that we read from left to right in English, because it doesn't happen in all languages, but we read from left to right, top to bottom, which also doesn't happen in all languages. And we need to teach those things. We need to point them out to the kids. So where shared reading is so useful to us, isn't it? Because it's an enlarged text that the children can see and that I'm pointing as I read. And I'm even going to say, notice I'm starting over here on the left-hand side. And by the way, whatever we want them to notice in reading, we want them to apply in writing, because by constructing writing and needing to use those sentence structures and concepts of print, etc., they will also learn that's how the language works, and it will help their comprehension. So part of my time has to be on writing as well as reading if we want kids to learn anything. Even if we want them to learn more about word recognition, we want them to write the words and be thinking about what sounds we hear in them and therefore what letters we'll use. So if they don't get to do that as writers, then their learning to read won't be as fast even.
And so important to do their own chosen reading and writing rather than be given a sentence that they have to copy and that sort of thing?
Yeah. We're not talking about copying. We're not talking about handwriting. We're talking about constructing. So it has to be coming from within them, even thinking about, if this is an idea I want to share, how will I need to write this sentence, in what order, and what words need to be in it. And depending on what I'm writing, because of what I've read or what's been read to me, I will know that it needs to be written in a different way. And so even fiction and non-fiction, reading both of those to kids becomes very important if we want them to hear the range of different sentence structures that they need to be able to read and write. And so what I mean by that is if you think about how a story might start, such as once upon a time there was a gentleman who married for the second time. So I'm starting to read a fairy tale, but when I'm going to read a non-fiction book that is like a report giving information, then the text goes like this. This is a book called Tarantulas Are Spiders. So even in the heading, I'm giving the information. Tarantulas have long fangs. Tarantulas have poison in their fangs. So it's even written in a different tense. Non-fiction is sort of like timeless, or it can be written more like it's the present tense, whereas fiction tends to be written in past tense because we're sort of telling about something that happened.
Yep.
So entirely different sentence structures and different use of verbs used just in those two different books. And then, of course, you could have a text on something like how to cook scones. So how does the sentence structure work in something that's a how to do or how to make? And so it's wash your hands, read the recipe, collect what you need, wear an apron. What's at the start of every sentence? A verb.
Yep.
So that's not what we're going to find when we read a story or even we read a report like tarantulas have, started with noun. And now we've got a completely different sentence structure. So if I'm going to need to easily comprehend this, I need to hear that sort of language structure and become familiar with it so that I would know how to use this as a reader. And then I also want the kids to be writing how to do and how to make, because I know by constructing that, that they'll become much more familiar with those sentence structures. So why I say when I'm choosing to read aloud to the kids and that I actually need to plan, of course I'm going to be reading aloud to them every day. And in a foundation classroom, it's probably going to happen 3 or 4 times a day. 1, because it's a great activity to be doing to the kids. 2, they sort of need the break from other sorts of things and they enjoy it. And I want them to realise that, books are wonderful and learning to read is wonderful and all those very positive things. But imagine how much the kids are learning because I read to them, and in particular, what I read to them, and then what they are allowed to read. And I say allowed because we know motivation affects how much children learn, and it will definitely affect their comprehension, because if you're motivated to read, you will want to read a lot and more often, and the more that you know about the variety, a greater variety of things, you'll therefore develop a greater width of vocabulary knowledge, come across many more sentence structure types and concepts of print and building background knowledge, world knowledge. So it's sort of like if you were going to fill your day with that, the children would learn an enormous amount. And I'm aware that I want it to be motivating, and so I'm not going to choose something boring. Like, who would purposely choose something boring to read to anyone? You would not choose something boring to read to yourself.
So the philosophy of we'll only teach them a certain level and then we'll move up to the next bit and then the next bit, and we won't go on to the next thing until they know that bit.
Well,
how does that work with what you're talking about?
Well, of course, there are some things that are sequential in their learning. Yep. For example, even the learning of how sounds are represented. I know that children, first of all, hear consonants, and even in their writing, they show you that they're aware of consonants because they'll write dog, D-G. And so I know that consonants are easier to work out what symbol, what letter will go with them. And also the children want to know that because it's what they're doing in their writing. So I'm going to teach consonant sounds before I'm going to teach vowel sounds. And I also know that short vowels have less ways of being represented than long vowels. So there's a really good sequence for me that makes sense, is usable. I also make sure that I include the teaching of onsets and rhymes, because then I'm making sure that right from the start, kids are getting to see where vowels are in words. So I have a sequence in that. But when it comes to comprehension, it's not like I must build their vocabulary before I build their sentence structure, before I blah, blah. And it's certainly not, I need to teach them all there is about word recognition before we're allowed to start teaching comprehension. And if anyone is out there telling you that, they haven't got a clue what they're talking about. You know, I can't tell you how many research articles will insist that comprehension teaching must not be forgotten and must start right at the beginning with the learning of word recognition. So is there a sequence in comprehension? The only thing that is sequential is the complexity of the text keeps increasing. So if I start with simple sentences, they'll be easier to understand than complex sentences. But it doesn't mean that they can't hear them, because so many of the greatest books for that age group actually have complex sentences, and it helps you to talk with the kids about what's the main thing that's happening in that sentence. And so, for example, Who Sank the Boat by Pamela Allen. By golly, you wouldn't have a foundation class without that book. It's something that the children enjoy so much and learn so much from, and love to join in with the reading of after the first few pages. But if you think about the first couple of sentences, the first one, beside the sea, on Mr. Pepper's place, there lived a cow, a donkey, a sheep, a pig, and a tiny little mouse. So what's the main thing that the author is telling us in that sentence, even though it's very complex? Beside the sea, on Mr. Pepper's place, there lived a cow, blah, 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 all right? So the main thing is that we're being introduced to these animals who are the characters in the story, and they lived beside the sea, okay? Then we get on to the next sentence. They were good friends, and one warm sunny morning, for no particular reason, they decided to go for a row in the bay. Now, kids understand that, and in fact, they love the sentence and they remember which word most of all. Particular. It's such an interesting word to them. Do you know who sank the boat? But let's go back to that complex sentence. I would actually use that to help the kids to realise the most important thing that's happening in that sentence is that these animals decided to go for a row in the bay. That's so important to understand what's the main thing happening in that story at that point in time. It's setting the scene for everything else that happens in the story. So again, I'm not going to spoil the story by the first time I read it, sort of parsing it and going back to working out exactly what happened. So I'm inclined to read the whole story, let the kids join in as they want to, and then when I go back and reread it, make sure that they understand exactly what's going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
But I can't ignore the understanding part of it, because it can sound fantastic. What a fabulous, interesting sentence. But will the children realise that, okay, the author's telling us that one day the animals decide to go for a row in the bay, all right? Or even to go for a row, because you'd have to be thinking then about, where do you go rowing? And I might have to unpack for the kids who don't know what it means to go for a row.
That's right. Yep.
Right? Mm-hmm. So all the time I'm thinking as a teacher, what's needed in order for the kids to understand what's happening in this text, even to the point where That second sentence I read, they were good friends. Who's they? I have to go back prior to that to find out who the author's referring to. Beside the sea, on Mr. Pepper's place, there lived a cow, a donkey, a sheep, a pig, and a tiny little mouse. Who's they? Who were good friends? Those animals. One warm sunny morning, they decided to go for a row in the bay. Who's they? Right. What does it mean to go for a row? Then, do you know who sank the boat? That's a question. The author is asking you a question. From what he's told you so far, or she, because it's Pamela Allen, from what she's told you so far, will you be able to answer that question? Do you know who sank the boat? And she's going to go on giving you more and more information so that you can then answer that question. But do you know how the information is going to be given? In the illustrations. And this is another thing about comprehending. If you do not take notice of more than the words on the page, then you may never understand what a text is about. So be very careful about saying to children, don't look at the pictures. There might be a reason why you don't look at the pictures. It might be don't look at the pictures to first of all work out what that word is. If you can't work it out or you don't know what it means, then you may need to look at the picture to help you with that because comprehension is so important. But sometimes the actual story information, or particularly in non-fiction books, there will be so much more information in the illustrative, the artwork, that if you don't look at that, you will not have a clue what this text's about. So there are a number of things going on here at the one time. It's not like I'm saying I'm going to teach about pronouns before I'm going to teach background knowledge or about using your own experience or thinking about the structure of a sentence. They're all happening at the same time. But I can be explicit in my teaching about pointing some of these things out. But it's not like for a week I'm only going to point out something about sentence structure and then the next week I'm only going to point out about something else.
And you don't make the rule that I'm not going on to a new thing unless they all know this other thing that I've just been teaching.
Oh, absolutely not. Because, you know, it's almost impossible to separate a lot of these aspects of comprehension that, you know, if you haven't got some background knowledge, you will not be able to infer. And if you don't look at the sentence structure, you won't be able to work out the main idea. You know, so, and the vocabulary being used in the sentence is going to affect what you understand about what's happening and what's the main idea. And, you know, your particular knowledge of what that word is, like to go for a row in the bay. Well, what if you don't know row or bay because of your background knowledge?
Yeah.
Then I'm going to need to do something about it, aren't I?
Yeah, and it's not that one thing comes first. You know, there's
No.
You could start at any one of them, couldn't you?
I could. And I can certainly have a focus in my teaching for a particular session so that I'm not trying to develop too many things at the one time.
Yep.
But it's a good reason to go back and reread the same text many times over. If it's the right text, if it's enjoyable, the kids will want it to be read over and over. And it will give you opportunities to bring up many other aspects about comprehension. But I'm certainly aware of what will be helping and what might be getting in the way, and even telling the children why I'm doing particular things and how they could make use of that in their own reading, because I think that's the very explicit part of teaching and learning too, not just telling them something, but letting them know why I'm telling it to them and how they could make use of it to help them in what they're doing in their reading and writing. All of those things are a necessary follow-through. So my planning over a term, over a week, over a day, you know, will include, am I making sure that I've got a variety of text types? Am I making sure that I think about, are they getting new vocabulary or is it all the same? Am I building their background knowledge about lots of topics by what I'm choosing to read? Or is it just all the same? Are the sentences really good, normal sentence structures in English so that it's helping them to pick up on those sentence structures and know how to read them and how to make sense of them? Which, is very interesting when you think about what I'm saying on that topic, and then you give kids something like this to read. This is one book: A Hot Hat, Cot Wrap, A Sad Dad. I'm reading in different pages. A Hut Hop, A Rod Cut, The Lid Lip, A Lap Dot, A Cat Dip, A Cod Hit, A Cap Ran. Now, a cup ran is the first of those sentences to actually have normal English language structure. Do I want the kids to be hearing frequent use of language structures that are not normal in English reading and writing?
I don't think so.
I don't think so at all. Do I want to give them that sort of thing to read? And by the way, you'd be hard pushed to actually understand, comprehend what any of those sentences are about. And you know what you will have to do in order to figure out anything? You will have to look at the pictures. Absolutely have to look at the pictures to work out what a hot hat is about, or something even harder, a hut hop. So use common sense. Above all, use common sense and think about the effect that what you're doing is going to have on the children's reading and writing. See, it's interesting. I can remember when children first started school, long ago when I first taught prep, so in 1972, we used to do the writing for them. We would think they can't write because they don't know how to spell everything yet, or they don't know how to construct a sentence, or, they don't know that when they hear a particular sound to put a particular letter or a possible letter. They don't know any of those things. So they can say the sentence and we'll write it for them. And we called that language experience work. Now, language experience work is extremely important because it's one of the easiest ways to make sure that you end up with some writing that's going to relate to their own experiences, that they'll be able to bring that meaning to what they're reading. And we can show them how what they say can be written down and can be read. But we didn't also let them write for themselves. And so we didn't know very much about what they were capable of doing, even with sound symbol relationships. But also, we would give them material to read that was only one sentence per line, and at the end of every line, that meant there was going to be a full stop. So when they did start writing, guess what they would do? At the end of every line on the page, they would put a full stop, even if it wasn't the end of a sentence. And you go, oh, aha, what I have taught them that I didn't mean to teach them, that's actually not a good thing for them to have learned, and now I have to help them unlearn it. And so that's what I mean by, they'll learn so much from what you do, but it won't always be a good thing. So we've got to be very careful about what we choose to read, what we demonstrate in writing, and how you work things out to comprehend. Again, use common sense. Observe what your children are doing. Learn so much from them. Look at the sorts of books you want them to be able to read and what you'll need to do to read aloud to them in order for them to ever be able to do it. So it's sort of like, if I stop now and that was what you thought most about, even just planning what you read aloud for the rest of the year, then I would feel satisfied. But I want to share a lot of other things with you, so we won't just stop there, Phil. Okay?
No, that's fine. Yeah.
But, I think planning your read aloud is one of the most important things that you do as a teacher. And planning what they've got access to for their own reading becomes part of that as well. So where will we go back to and do some specifics about what we need to teach and how we would teach it. Let me think about something I want the kids to learn very quickly. And I brought it up when I was reading Who Sank the Boat, and I talked about the kids needing to understand who they was. And that is called cohesive ties, or it could also be referred to by some researchers as anaphoric relationships. And what that means is that the noticing of pronouns in sentences and helping the kids to realise who the pronouns or what the pronouns are referring to, because they are an essential part of understanding for comprehending, and they occur frequently. So that if I was to pick up almost any book that I'm going to read aloud to the kids and that they're going to read themselves, if it's got good sentence structure in it. See, the interesting thing is they would learn nothing about pronouns in those sentences, or they weren't even real sentences that I read before.
And we'll take a break there from part 1 of our podcast. We look forward to you joining us for part 2. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.